Good afternoon and welcome to the public meeting, monthly meeting of the Massachusetts Board of Early Education and Care. I want to thank all of you who are joining us. We are, as some of you know who follow these meetings, we are obviously well into the reopening stage and having an ongoing conversation about what that means for the strategic action planning that we had commenced last winter and for which the guiding principles, I think, really held in many ways as helpful and sort of structures during the crisis phase, but especially now during the reopening. I know the commissioner and team have been looking hard at the plan in terms of the implementation and to be sure that we're not thinking about too many parallel tracks, but rather a vision for the system during the pandemic and post-pandemic. And so I want to continue to thank the field for their tremendous dedication. The excellent work and care continues right through this very difficult and challenging time. And look forward to a discussion today about the strategic action plan and the fiscal landscape, both sort of FY21, but also talking more in terms of principles and priorities as we also go forward and look ahead eventually to FY22. I don't have any more specific comments. I think the only thing I'll flag is there is some conversation, sort of state level, both in communities more locally and among some of us, sort of how do we think about supporting our youngest learners in the remote space, very difficult kind of space, obviously developmentally. These are not little bodies meant to sit for too long. And I think one of the things I mentioned to a couple folks last week was sort of we may want to think about especially in EEC settings that are providing support to remote learners in the K-12 system. We may just want to think about how we understand supports for them. We might want to think a little more about behavioral supports and body breaks and more movement, and also perhaps as the field continues to think creatively, even to think about whether reading is an indicator by which we might differentiate kids who are ready for some more screen time versus those who may need more of a hybrid, if you will, care with those early educators who are overseeing right now the learning experience. But I'll just put that out there, and I know the commissioner is starting to think about it as well. We're hearing from the field some of the challenges in that space. So I won't say anything more, but look forward to the agenda that the commissioner and her team have put together and look forward to discussing with all of you. Secretary does not have comments. Commissioner, I'll turn it over to you.
Absolutely. So thank you, and thank you everyone for all the continued support. And I want to echo Chair Lasso's real appreciation for the way that the field is stepping up and continues to be the support for children and families during this critical time. I just wanted to highlight as we go through today, just giving a quick state of where we are. We do have over 75% of our programs that have been back in operations and indicated that they are back in operations, indicating just over 70% of capacity for the state. So again, lost some of our, consistent from what you've seen over the last few months, lost some of our larger group and school age providers that were at the lower end of the subsidy scale are being and represented more capacity loss. While we have many family childcare providers coming back, obviously there's a difference in numbers they can serve. So when we look at that, it's incredible, but I think we are also still seeing the struggles right now of understanding how families are making decisions on a community by community basis. And so paying attention to the fact that the demand for programs seems to be somewhat inconsistent and unpredictable right this second, as school districts are making decisions about their instructional approach and the impact that families that's having on the impact on family choices. And so we are closely watching that and making sure that we are trying to gather the best information possible to make decisions. One thing I want to note on the materials that you see for today's meeting is that we don't don't yet have updated information at the granularity that we've had in the past. And mostly that is because, as you remember, a lot of the information we had been sharing with you had been through a self-reported survey. That was our best lens. We are in the middle right now of updating that survey, of doing a big communication push and getting some new questions out there. So really encouraging our programs to answer that so that we get a high enough percentage response rate to start analyzing and bring new updated information back to you all now that the school year has begun. So we know that parents and demand is shifting. We don't have a great lens to that real time, working on building that, and excited to bring that back to you once we have the survey really have enough answers to the survey to make it worth bringing the data back. So I just wanted to highlight that. So this information is based on capacity, but the demand of where it's being utilized is really still in an analysis mode, and really encouraging all our programs to please help us fill out that survey so we can get some good data to aggregate and bring back to discussion with the board. Also, one really quick thing I wanted to just highlight from our last conversation is that we do have, and this was sent out in our email, and know many of you received this as well, but that there is, at this point, there is we have been able to secure rapid response mobile testing for our providers where there are cluster cases. And so information went out this week, whatever day it is, it went out recently to the field to make sure that there is some indication of what the criteria was, and knowing that we're still working on the protocols, but that that is available for anyone who meets that criteria. And then finally, I just wanted to highlight, I know this will be a point of conversation today, and many of you have brought this up to me in different ways, but just working with DESE and EOE on some of those strategies that Noni, that Chair Lasso was talking about, that of really thinking about how we support young learners given the remote instruction model, and ways that we can really figure out how to adjust the model, particularly for children who are accessing non-parental care and may need some additional strategies or coordination, and obviously that as all of you have pointed out in various ways of making sure that the models are developmentally appropriate and developmentally supportive to mitigate the learning loss that we know is a potential if we are not paying attention to this. So with that, I just wanted to highlight those things as we head into the bulk of the meeting, and Chair Lasso, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you. Any comments or questions before we move on from folks? Feel free to jump in. Joni.
Hi, thank you. I just want to say that I know a lot of my colleagues in the field very much appreciate all the communication that's coming out from EEC. Sometimes it's a lot and it seems like an overload, but I always think of information as power, and thank you for providing all that information.
Yeah, thank you for the feedback. It is a lot, but doing with what we can.
Yeah, I agree. It's excellent. And the tone is great. It feels, I think it builds some level of community as well. Yeah, it's
absolutely great. Yeah, thank you.
Anyone else? Comments or questions before we move on? All right, quickly, approval of minutes from our September 15th, 2020 meeting. Looks fine to me, but folks may have edits. Any edits or comments on those minutes? All right, make the motion that we approve the minutes from the September 15, 2020 meeting. Do I have a second?
Second.
All right, I'm just gonna go around on my Brady Bunch gallery view. You're just gonna be ready to go. Joni Block.
Yes.
Eleonora Villegas Reimers.
Yes.
Nikki Ruiz de Luzuriaga.
Yes.
Sheila Balboni.
Yes.
Carolyn Kane.
Yes.
Joan Wassergish.
Yes.
Mary Wallachy.
Yes.
Jim Pizer.
Yes.
Dave Cruz.
Yes.
Allison Schoenwald.
Yeah.
Great, that's everybody. All right, let's launch in. I will turn it back over to the commissioner on the first item, the strategic action plan, the progress in that domain. Was really helpful, just kind of refresh on the pieces and look forward to this discussion.
Excellent, thank you. So as Charlotte was saying, wanted to go deeper into some of the work around the strategic action plan this time around. And I think in particular, having had a number of conversations with you all over the last few months as we've been grappling with how we do accommodate a strategic action plan in the middle of a COVID crisis, and where these still drive our perspective going forward. Really also looking at intentionally at a lot of the work that you all had been involved in a variety of ways around some of the supports for programs and thinking about that backbone of QRIS for programs and weaving that into an articulation of our theory of change specifically for programs and going deeper into that today. I don't want to make it sound like that's in exchange for other things. I think that given the interest and the involvement in the board in many of these components, it made sense to start here and as developmentally where these components are in the department's work. But I wanted to highlight that the intention is over the next few meetings to bring each of these audiences. If you remember back when we passed the strategic plan, this had been the intention in March, and revisiting it and getting back into the specifics of being able to go pillar by pillar, audience by audience, and talk about how the theory of change for each one of these key critical stakeholders and component of our systems might look as EEC engages in developing backbones for quality, and in particular thinking about the goals and strategies for each one of these really critical elements of the systems change that we're headed towards. So on that, that's the goal for today, with a couple key things that we're thinking about in terms of updates from COVID that either are forcing us to think about things that we've used to invest in programs slightly differently, or change in course. I don't want to say change in North Star, but change in order of activities as we've thought about moving forward towards that North Star that we've all created together. So we'll talk about that today, and then really using that to also talk about some of the conversations that we've been headed towards as a department around some of the uncertainty in the budget year ahead, and really understanding with all of you all how we revisit the priorities we set before we knew that it would be such an unpredictable budget year, and then revisit how give you an update on where we are and offer an opportunity for us to talk about any of those priorities that need to be revisited from the work that the board passed last fall. So that's the agenda for today, and looking forward to getting right into it. So if we can move on to the next slide. I'm not going to spend a ton of time revisiting slides that you all have seen, but wanted to make sure that you knew that these build on the strategic plan goals for each of these audiences that we've been using as our foundation, and moving to the next slide of ensuring that you remember that this all falls into strategic actions and strategic innovation areas that will be our goals, how we will be focusing on achieving those goals through the strategic action plan. So all of this is things you have seen before, and so certainly don't need to continue to address those, but this really wanted to talk in today of where we are looking at each of those actions and how these start to build a theory of change that makes us in a position to evaluate our energy in relation to the goal we're trying to achieve. So I'll go through quickly some of the actions driving results, and then, as I said, really want to spend time today on the program component and have an opportunity at the subsequent meetings to dig deeper into each of these components as the team here at EEC is ready to talk a little bit more about specific elements as we work through the creation and development process in relation to some of the work ahead. So you have here the beginnings of a theory of change for the children and youth and family domain that we were looking at. So really understanding that what we want in order to achieve this is access to high quality programs, and here that meet families' needs. So as we discussed in March and prior to March, that there's not a one size fits all for families, and so helping us understand the variety of programs that families need, but then making sure that they are accessible, affordable, all of the barriers that families may have to getting to those programs, that are results for to be able to ensure that children are on track to third grade means that families need access to those resources that help ensure that they are there. And that this will be tracked in some of the outcomes you see on the right-hand side here. So really looking at aligning across the conversation around birth to third grade metrics and what we should be looking at. We've talked a lot about using the on track to high school graduation as a thought-provoking element to think around how we look at earlier metrics for young children and their families and the context they're growing up in, but then also making sure that those programs are accessible, looking at access gaps and deserts, childcare deserts, and then also making sure that we're looking at some metrics around screening. So thinking not about what the screening results are, but understanding that families are engaging in developmental screening as a way to make sure that they are engaged in what their children should be knowing and being able to do over the course of development, and can help intervene and seek out services. I often use my brother as an example, but he's calling me constantly and asking questions, and those are just that you want families to have those resources to be able to know when things are on track or not, even if they don't have a sister to call. Joni, did you have a question? I'm sorry. Oh, you're on mute. I'm hearing.
No, I just moved my hand. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Thank you.
I just wanted to make sure.
Thank you.
Okay, so moving to the next slide of really being able to think about this in terms of educators and professionals. So really, again, looking at our educator credential framework as a key action that we're going to take that will result in really thinking about the job embedded PD aligned with pathways for our workforce, that really thinks about, again, when we think about improving quality for young children and their families, it is about the quality of the humans that interact with them, because we know that well-trained, well-compensated, well-supported professionals are providing that kind of responsive caregiving and responsive support for families. So really thinking that if we can build those pathways, keep people in the field, ensure that we are respecting and growing their competency, that we will be able to achieve the positive change we see of retaining people, really thinking where we need to measure and support increased competencies for those professionals who do reflect the communities that they are serving. In that, I do want to highlight that some of these changes in where we are for COVID have looked differently. I think originally a lot of this was growing the professionals. A lot of it was about increasing competencies. Obviously, right now with the pandemic, we are incredibly nervous about just retaining and not losing any more professionals. And so our metric here has shifted given the reality of the landscape right now, and just want to highlight that in ways that we're thinking about being able to pivot from some of the growth we wanted to see to preventing some of the loss we now fear. So moving on to the next one that will be the focus of our conversation today, is really looking at programs and again, the actions that we are looking at in not only building and operationalizing the QRIS that many of you have built, been involved in building, but then also making sure that that becomes the backbone, meaning our supports are foundationally targeted to that quality backbone, as well as making sure that we are we're compensating and supporting the comprehensive resources that programs need to be high quality, because they cannot be responsible for everything, housing and food and all of that. How do you make sure that there are those comprehensive supports around those? So again, really looking at making sure that the results for the programs become a aligned quality measure that everyone is using to define quality in programming, but then really thinking and using that to evaluate our capacity building and our investments in programs and the comprehensive wraparound services that they need. Again, really looking at our program, again, I will say highlight again that while many of these are consistent with the strategic plan, some of them are the strategic action plan metrics that we had discussed in March. Some of them, again, are really looking at mitigating the loss as opposed to the growth that we intended. And so just focusing on that somewhat. Again, I'm going to go into a little bit deeper around the actions and the results for programs today. So I'm going to skip over some of these. But yes, Joni.
I do have a question now.
Yeah.
Thanks. So I love to see the progression of this. It really pulls it together. Thank you, everybody, for putting this together. I'm curious about when we define quality and when we talk about quality. In one instance, we're talking about programs, quality in programs, but then in the third box, the high quality, here we're talking about classrooms. And I'm wondering if we're thinking of using the QRIS as the indicator, I think we need to somehow put in something about the other programs and resources that EEC is utilizing to improve outcomes for young children and families.
Yeah, so I think that this is multifold. I think that right now we have a QRIS that is largely driven towards a group and school age approach to quality definition. And so one of the challenges we do have is that's in a slightly different place. Is to make sure that we are creating metrics of quality that are more appropriate to family childcare domains, for example, and school-based preschool, for example. So those kind of programs. But I think that there's actually something else you're saying in there. So I wanted to first highlight the first component, which is this is that really when we mean teaching and learning, it is broader than just the center-based classroom. So I wanted to start there, and that's not what we mean, but we do have some work to do there. I think the other question that you're asking around some of the comprehensive supports, part of that, or supports other than non-parental out-of-home care that families are relying on and supporting, and the quality of those too, that hasn't been as much, I think, a measurable impact of this certainly is in our actions of really thinking about identifying the comprehensive supports that families need, making sure that we are working with communities through our family and children lens to make sure that they have access to a variety of supports that may be funded outside of EEC, DPH, DTA. There are a lot of different supports that families need and rely on. And that hasn't been so much our measurable change, since our purview is so specifically on a certain construct of programs, and been using more of that on more of our measurable change on the kind of programs families can access and how we are supporting their access to those quality programs, as opposed to our purview over those programs specifically, which can be limited.
Okay, all right. Thank you. I guess this goes, if I can just follow up with the comment, when we talk about the term like childcare deserts and out-of-home care, I would encourage us to use the term education or early childhood in addition to childcare, because I don't want us to limit the impact that some of our initiatives could have
Yeah. I think one of the challenges of that, Joni, though, is that like when we're talking about childcare deserts, it's pretty specific of the number of children who birth to 14 who have access to out-of-home care outside of the school district. So I think that it is that negotiating the conversation around how we specifically address the child care element and also recognize the comprehensive services that are necessary outside of childcare, because not every child needs childcare, but every family needs resources of some kind. How do we mix those? How do we create a lens that will address the comprehensive nature of child development while also doing justice to the very specific role that EEC has for childcare that no other department has any purview over. And I think that's some of the challenge we tried to grapple with in this, and trying to move some of that to the child and family lens, and seeing our critical responsibility in ensuring child and family development, but also really the 85% of our funding goes towards programs, and 75% of our staff are focused on a specific type of program that no one else engages with. So I think that balance is going to be really tricky as we move forward too. And certainly that's the way, I mean, part of what I was just coming from and had to change the time of the meeting was a presentation in the state of Alaska that had the same sort of grappling with how do you make decisions around childcare and the multiple functions there, and the comprehensive nature of development that requires more than just that.
I would just add one other thing, which is just to highlight the fact that at this moment in time, for sure, we especially don't want to lose the focus on supply and demand, which is significant, right? Always has been. We've never met the demand in ways that are material and serious, but particularly now, given the commissioner's opening remarks about where we are in terms of capacity, we definitely want to keep the supply and demand relationship front and center.
Mm-hmm.
I totally understand, and I see this. I mean, we have terminology. I guess I just always keep in my mind the notion of the development of our department. And as we're meeting the child care needs of families right now, I think subsumed in that is also the educational pieces that we can integrate and incorporate. That's it. So thank you for addressing that.
Yeah, Joan, sorry. Oh, sure, Sheila, I don't.
Right, and not to belabor this, because I know we've been through some of these discussions, but I had one question with regard to the quality and criteria related to the education of children. And in the past, we've talked a lot about grade 3 reading levels. I really didn't understand the reference to high school graduation. Could you just?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the parallel that I've been trying to think about in terms of what we mean by on track to 3rd grade has been driven by some of the research on track to high school graduation. So one of the things that really became apparent in that research is that it wasn't junior year test scores that were best predictors of high school graduation. It was that transition into high school. If kids showed up on the first day, did their parents go to high school? Did they meet a guidance counselor? Did they come straight for the first week or not? And I think about that in terms of the 3rd grade scores, that what we know, and I don't want to limit that to 3rd grade reading either. I mean, 3rd grade social emotional development is the same thing. You can math development, right? You can take it to any domain. That what we know is the best indicator if you're on track to 3rd grade is not what your 2nd grade test scores were. It was if you take literacy, the number of words you heard in birth to 3, the number of the kind of scaffolded vocabulary that was used in preschool. So how do we start to look at some of those contextual factors to help understand if we're setting children up for on track to 3rd grade, not just, and that's where screening comes in, right? Do parents know what to expect from you? Do they know you're off track? And so how do we think about using information systems? I think to Joni's earlier point, the comprehensive nature of resources that families are relying on, and starting to track our obligation as a society to help people get there as more comprehensive than just what their scores are.
Thank you. That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Joan, yeah.
I really appreciate this conversation. There's so much richness in here, and I think so many really important points have been made. I just want to highlight a couple that really stand out to me. One is this idea of really understanding the broader developmental context for children and really being active in ensuring connections to a broad spectrum of comprehensive resources, I think is exactly the right direction. But what that really points to is how critical these intersections are beyond EEC and those partnerships with multiple agencies. We've talked historically a lot about HHS and DTA and DCF, but also I think increasingly in the context of the pandemic, we also really want to be paying more and more critical attention to the intersection with DESE. Yes. Because right now, I think we're seeing the implications of K-12 decisions about whether to open, in what capacity, for whom, is a tremendous driver of families' decisions making around early education and care. It's also a huge driver in terms of decisions about whether to participate in the labor force and how to do that. And that, of course, speaks to whether or not a family can financially support their children and contribute to a stable developmental context for kids. So I think it really points to how critical some cross-agency leadership is in bringing about more coordination and more stability for families if we're going to get to the kinds of outcomes that we're talking about. And then I think the last point that really stands out to me is as we appropriately look forward and focus on program quality and support, I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that even though a very relatively high percentage of programs are open, they're opening with much lower enrollment, much less capacity. It's hard for folks to find staff to come in. It's hard for us to retain and attract high quality staff right now. And so we have to be really mindful of shoring up the current system in order to be able to go forward toward this more ambitious and I think correct vision. But we've got to maintain and invest now if we're going to get to this place down the line.
Yeah, no, I think that it's critically important. And I think that, what you'll see as we progress on the presentation today is some work we're doing to shore up our part of the coordination across the components and theory of change that we have oversight at EEC. But I think you're really, hitting the nail on the head of what we're hearing back from the community as well as this challenge of our programs are really responding to a broader context and landscape that not the least of which is the national research or the national numbers coming out about women leaving the workforce and questions like that. That Massachusetts, I think, is paramount when we're thinking about sustainability of our programs and the context in which they're operating in. So I think that's the question of we'll go into our system a little bit. The question I think a little bit more is where there's broader implications from the community.
I do think that in many ways this has been a story through the pandemic in all sectors, but it highlights in many ways, the crisis highlights where we have areas of coordination and where things are really working together, and it highlights fragments and places and pressure points and areas we need to keep working. And I think, Joan, you're right, the notion of sort of birth to 8 when you have 2 agencies is sort of coming to light as like we're not quite there on the pathway piece, and we need to think harder about that and potentially use some of today's context to do that in service of mission. Both agencies have a very similar mission, both serve lots of families through different kids, and we should be thinking hard about that. And I think in the weeks to come, especially as we think about these youngest learners in the remote space, and as we continue, you're right, to not just focus on the reopening stats, but in fact, who are we serving and how many and what does that represent? You're right. We need to keep thinking that way. I don't know if Secretary, you wanted to jump in on anything in terms of the cross-agency piece.
No, other than to acknowledge that it's a good point. And the, you know, and I think we may have brought this up the last time, as important as it is in terms of coordinating at a state level, that in some ways is more about modeling the kind of coordination and integration that needs to happen at the local level, which is where these kinds of relationships and programmatic connections and real pathways get created. Which is not to sort of say that the state level stuff doesn't matter. It certainly does in terms of creating the framework, in terms of allocating certain incremental or marginal resources. But it's a culture shift as much as it is a bureaucratic shift, I guess is what I'm trying to get at.
Mhm.
Yeah, and how do we enable and how do we accelerate, facilitate that kind of culture shift? Absolutely, and think about it in local terms, because you're right, the other piece of the pandemic is that it has highlighted the very real and material differences among communities and their needs as a result. Yeah.
Yeah, I think,
I
sorry,
was
Sheila.
going to say, and not to lose the focus on town government and city government too, as partners in that whole issue.
Yeah.
And I think that's it, is that, and to the Secretary's point, we can create some modeling of what it looks like to coordinate across, but Sheila, to your point, is that ultimately it's the local, whoever it is, whether it's a local municipality, a local district, a local community leader that is going to have a better lens into how children are sharing their day across systems. And that, you know, that really needs to be our focus, is how we can, as seamlessly as possible, ensure that children are getting what they need across systems, and not having to navigate various rules and regulations, as opposed to really providing the context for the coordination that can happen.
So I wonder too, just to flag something before we move on, because I don't want to hold you up any further, but I wonder if this is just something to think about, that where there's an opportunity for a pilot or two of something that would be great long-term, not just in light of the pandemic, but what areas in the birth to 8 pathway is there opportunity for some interesting pilots to the Secretary's point, in places where there is some groundwork that's laid already for some interesting innovation. We ought to just think about that collectively.
I'm sure lots of folks will have good ideas on that, but you know, I think we already have a lot of examples that are percolating in local communities that I think become exemplars and can also, I think, give us a framework and a pathway for thinking about how to encourage this similar kind of activity in a lot of different places, right? So Noni, you were talking about that critical nexus between supply and demand. And one of the things that we know is so important is, for programs to be sustainable, we have to have mechanisms for aggregating demand and more tightly affiliating demand and supply than our historic market has allowed for, right? And we know that that market is effectively broken. And so, you know, just 3 quick examples that we see coming from different players. We have the Lawrence Public Schools that are taking a very active role in partnering with community-based providers to ensure that kids are in safe and supportive environments, whether they're physically in a school building or home or in a community-based setting, and they're dedicating district dollars to support that effort. We have folks like Care That Works, based in Boston, working with folks who are in the construction industry, who need care at 5 and 5:30 a.m., who are making an intentional effort to partner with family-based childcare providers to open early to meet the needs of employers in a particular industry. And then you have individual employers, like there was an article about Broad in Cambridge, partnering in order to open up childcare for its employees. You have 3 different players operating at the local level who are all taking critical steps to create conditions for childcare and early education and out-of-school time programs to be successful. I think the question for us is what more can we be doing at the state level to elevate those types of examples, to create frameworks, to facilitate partnerships, and to be responsive and encouraging of more of that.
Yeah, right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Can I add one more thing? And I would go even farther than just the birth to 8, because what we're seeing right now is that it's literally the age group that we cover in the out of school time of going up to age 13. It's still in our hands right now. And with all the things that are happening and all the new arrangements that are happening, we are already in that area, and yet we are not coordinating enough with the other educators that are working with the same group of kids. So the more that we can coordinate and do more, we have really right now a lot of pilot testing going on that we could learn from to then think about when we come out of this situation, how do we coordinate better with the two groups of educators and the two groups of everything, the two systems that we have, how do we unify them and coordinate them better?
Yeah. Well,
and can I just do a little bit of a shout out for the mayor of Lawrence too, who has provided funding for parents who aren't eligible for some of our subsidies.
Yeah, yeah, I think that is. Yeah, I think you know, to Oliver's point, I think that the cities that and community leaders have been able to try to understand where kids are during the day and try to identify strategies, to your point, of either funding or at least coordinating across gives a great model that we should be learning from, because I think that there's a need for us to think about, you know, how do we accommodate the environment the child is in while we still provide the kind of robust instruction that is needed to keep kids learning. And so I think that that's going to be some of the questions and challenges ahead. And you know, as we've seen as we've seen the system start up for the school year, we're seeing real live examples of both problem solving and challenges that may take some momentum to address.
And maybe the one clarification that I'd make is maybe my use of the word pilot. I wanted to be more generic, which is the pilot could be a scaling up of something that is boutique-y right now, right? Where, you know, so we have lots of examples, but they tend to be pretty small scale. And this may be a moment in partnership with some various communities or places where the commissioner and her team deem sort of ready for kind of a, let's say, an intermediate scaling, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of opportunities there, I think, and I have spent, I mean, as this has popped up and understanding around the state, have spent the last week just trying to get with national colleagues who have all been looking at different ways. And I mean, to be clear, to Chair Lusso's point, like the entire country is grappling with this. There's no model that we're just saying like, okay, just do that and it will all be fine. Right. And so it is really about thinking innovatively, trying to identify models that might that might be able to address the specific needs of both young learners, but also, to Eleonora's point, that it's young learners, but also those learners who are in different situations than be assumed you're at home. And so those two dynamics are, I think, become challenging when compounded, young learners in childcare, but certainly both are dynamics that we can be grappling with and thinking about options for.
I know we need to move on, so I'll be quick. You know, I was just wondering, Noni mentioned the word scale or even begin to scale. Right now, I'm just wondering, is there even a place where people can go and hear about innovative programs? I mean, just some kind of, is there any sort of way that we could figure out, and Sam, you have enough on your plate. I'm not suggesting you take this on necessarily. But is there some way to highlight, if it doesn't exist, like what is already happening that's innovative, that someone could go to a place and just learn about, you know, what's happening in Lawrence or what's happening in Worcester, and then they have the opportunity to follow up if they want to or not, while we figure out sort of where the best practice models are. Just a thought. And maybe it exists and I just don't know about it.
I'm not familiar, but I don't know if the Secretary has other lenses from the DESE space that might be an opportunity to hear about some of this, or if we're creating those.
Sorry, Commissioner, what were you asking?
If there are spaces where we understand where people might be able to learn about some of the innovative models happening at communities, I know of just anecdotally from, like Sheila saying, I don't know if there is a space, that DESI's creating, or if that's an opportunity for us to collaborate on something.
We should certainly keep having that conversation. I mean, obviously, to some extent, everybody's a little bit in crisis mode. As we're still in the school reopening phase. By the same token, these issues, in particular, the intersection and overlap between the early ed space and the K-12 space, has never been more front and center. So I think we're probably seeing some things in real time that we ought to be able to follow up on.
Great,
Yeah,
I agree. It's good.
Okay. Awesome. So I'm going to just keep going with this conversation, but I think all very much builds from what is EEC's role in trying to build some of this together, and both in the decisions we're making right now, but also how we are making decisions and building our own systems in a way that foster the kind of local innovation, but I think also really thinking about strengthening the childcare field in a way, and programs in a way that they can continue to collaborate at the local level more seamlessly and more effectively. So moving on to the next slide really quickly, I will, before we get into that specifically, just want to highlight that our EEC system is a key part of this too, and understanding that if we are going to focus on a user-centric approach, meaning streamlining our functions. So if you're an educator and you may have to get a background record check and a certification and your early ed essentials, that we think about sort of what is your path through those as seamlessly as possible, as opposed to just having to grapple with different functions at EEC. And so really being oriented towards that is something we're doing right now, with the idea that if we can take less time across navigating different EEC functions, that we can grow the field by having them focus more, having professionals in the field focus more on the work they're doing and less on the navigating the bureaucracy in many ways. I will also highlight, just because I just came off this conversation with Alaska, is that as we were talking about our strategic plan and sort of the history of EEC and where we are now and where we're going, I also highlighted this as an opportunity to really take the consolidated governance structure and think about really bringing that to the next updated level. So as you have a creation of EEC, part of that was a consolidation of different functions, and where we are now with new research about QRIS, new research about program improvement and the levers around program improvement and leadership, thinking about the types of educator credential work that has come out of research nationally, and trying to think about where our consolidated governance structure and the system, the state system that we're creating, can really be leveraged and use that research to the next level to help achieve our goals for programs for children and families and communities, and for educators as a whole. So I just wanted to highlight that, having just come off of this, that I think that this is an opportunity for us to really take the infrastructure that Massachusetts was a vanguard in creating, and understanding how we can update the components and functions of it in a way that help us understand and respond to the research that drives the results we're looking for in our stakeholders. So moving on to the next slide. So this is where we wanted to take a closer look at where we are in terms of the theory of change for programs. And so really looking at, there are two real key components of this work, and really is thinking about a definition of quality and understanding the program stability and the economic model. So again, I just want to point out, I think with Joni's earlier comment, that this program that we're talking about is really looking at the out-of-home non-parental care programs that we've seen a dramatic decline in Massachusetts over the last 3 years. So really honing in on that kind of outcome, not saying that that is the only work of EEC, but honing in on what is our role to really think about sustainability and innovation in program design. So really thinking about the unified definition of quality, making sure that we are both looking at the QRIS as a key component of this, and really making sure we take the QRIS that was developed and create the information on how we operationalize that, how we measure, how we make sure our staff is ready to integrate that into our system, but then also making sure that we are looking at all of our functions. I know Sheila brought up at the last meeting around residential and placement programs and really coordinating our role as a licensor, but not a funder for residential and placement programs, and understanding how we can also ensure quality in those programs when we have different functions than we do for other programs that we license or monitor. And again, really thinking about for the economic model, as we look at program stability and making sure that we're investing in the types of services that we are aligned with our definition of quality. And making sure that is, as we talked about in this, right now, the country functions on a per child per day model of financing, and knowing that particularly in COVID, but we knew before COVID that is leading to instability in programs, as a demand, to Joan's earlier point, a demand-driven model really is difficult to keep up with in real time in a way that stabilizes the programs that are serving those family demand. And so really understanding where we need to think and change some of that if we're going forward. All of this, I think, that is not quite as captured on this slide, but I want to make sure you know is a key component, is around the comprehensive supports on there. So we are not the mental and behavioral health grants, the professional development centers, coordinated family and community engagement grants. I just call the acronyms. I gotta stop using that. And thank you, CFCs. We think about those as all needing to build around the programs as well as having their own independent services. So I don't want to take that away from here, but I also just want to point out that some of the focus of this will be around our efforts to really sustain childcare programs in particular, and our licensing function, leveraging our licensing function in that way. So moving on to the next slide. I wanted to look at the data that we have at this point and what we're looking at. So when we think about the unified definition of program quality, that we see different needs now. So these, of course, are similar objectives as what we had prior to COVID, but I think what we wanted to do in this slide is also just understand how our current reality is shaping how we're going about these priorities. And so we see that there is very different needs of providers than there were prior, really thinking about staffing models, for example, where floaters were a reliable approach to making sure you could combine classrooms, where you have and were the ability to create a sustainable business or operating model. Now, where you have different staffing requirements, where staff have to do and prioritize different activities like cleaning and not just engagement. The staffing patterns and hours have to be different, as well as families are making different choices. And so when we define quality, we can't simply right now define it on parent demand, because parents are making choices about more than just what kind of program they have access to, as well as the family communication is much more rapid response than long-term relationship building as we're looking at this, but not to lose the fact that this is all about program sustainability and program quality nonetheless, even though the quality and the ways we're evaluating quality now look different. And I say that because while our QRIS 2.0 continues to prioritize those things, as I said, said, mostly in a center-based model as for right now, but those things that are about the interaction, those high quality interactions between children and supportive caregivers, right now, those have to be measured differently. So we're focused not quite so much on how we measure the right interactions right now, but really how do we integrate all of EEC's function to support flexibility in programs to make those decisions, given this change in reality. In addition, when we look at the economic model, we see that this economic model, given where we are with COVID, families are looking very differently at how they are deciding to choose programs, and our economic model of being a per child funding model right now, either by a parent paying a tuition or by us subsidizing that individual parent's tuition, that there are a lot of increased expenses that model doesn't account for, and the fluctuation in parents are really jeopardizing our ability to sustain the field. And so while we are incredibly proud of the fact that so much of our field has stepped back up and into operations, we see two things. One, significant part of the field actually either deciding to close or not knowing whether they can step back into operations. And two, for those that are back in operations, the decreased attendance and enrollment and increased operational costs is causing increased instability in that economic model, which is something we're trying to address as well. Does someone have a question before I move on? I thought I saw a hand. Oh, Joan, yeah.
So part of what's so striking is the need for stability right now, but I'm really struck by how much this shift in economic model, I think, draws on what we've been learning historically as well, because I think we're really kind of shifting from understanding that delivering quality requires a bunch of different inputs to really understanding that delivering quality requires this broader context and setting for a program in order for educators to be successful. And in some ways, this is what K-12 learned a very long time ago. And I think part of what we're pointing to is a shift where we essentially want to establish something akin to a foundation budget that allows for a baseline delivery of stability and quality. And then on top of that, we can lay things like subsidies and like parent payments and potentially, public-private partnership dollars to enable a more robust and functional model. But I think that this shift is really a critical one, and it can't happen soon enough. So I'm curious to see what you're going to put up next.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that this is, it certainly is something that my administrator colleagues across the country and I are talking about regularly, the fact that we all knew that this was an unstable funding model prior, but now we are confronted with the fact that there is so much more instability based on the landscape that we're functioning in. So totally, I think that there's it. So we'll get to some of the specifics of that in 1 second. When we move to the next slide. And I apologize, there's construction going on in the office. So if you hear a lot of background noise, I'm trying to mitigate it. But so again, you have here, we're gonna get a fire alarm, watch this.
Yeah, I think it's a fire alarm. We're expected to evacuate, I think.
If it is a fire alarm, we may have to pause for a second. So let's see what that happens. So the program quality backbone that we're talking about with the QRIS is it really remains the foundation of what was created prior to my coming, with some edits that will help streamline and simplify some of the operationalization that allows us to grow, create a foundation that allows us to grow from over time. So one, really thinking about, as we talked about in the strategic action planning, the elevation of our licensing standards as quality. We have some of the most rigorous licensing standards in the country, and making sure that that is respected and is a unified definition definition of an entry point into our quality rating and improvement scale. So that is one thing that we've been really thinking about, is that where do we need to look at and understand licensing and updates, but with the idea that that becomes an entry point as opposed to a separate system. And then really looking at then how you capture in a backbone of quality the living, breathing nature of quality improvement, and that it isn't a point in time measurement. What it is and the hardest thing, right, that we know across the country, depending on the system, whether it's K-12 or early childhood or human services, that what makes a difference for quality improvement is an active quality improvement mentality and approach, and willingness to learn and integrate new information and have those reflective conversations, and is not about whether you can fill out the right form and submit it to someone. It is about that active engagement. And so what we're trying to do here is think about how we use the continuous quality improvement plan as a way to help evaluate that real real measurement we're looking for in a QRIS, which is the approach to continuous quality improvement. But then really thinking about where and how the supports need to be targeted in different areas of quality, so that they're appropriate to meeting the program where they're at. And then, as I recognize as well, is understanding that is somewhat specific to right now. Our model is somewhat specific in an evaluation that's appropriate for center-based programs, but that there is likely an option that likely a process that we will have to engage in around family child care. We are being evacuated from the building, so not exactly sure how to put you on pause, and then I can let you know in a second, but we are being evacuated and I'm being told I have to leave.
Yeah.
All right, friends, you better go. I think the rest of us can, Christina, maybe you can just put us back in the waiting room until Sam is back with Sean and others. If you can potentially add 30 minutes to your schedule, if at all possible, I think that would be ideal.
So sorry.
Sam, go. All right.
I do have a hard stop at 4:30.
Yeah.
I just have to pick up my daughter from childcare.
Yes, that is a hard stop. There is no negotiating that 4:30.
Ethan, this is Ethan's Zoom, so I don't know if he was able to pause the live stream.
Oh, right. There is the live stream.
So just waiting for him to chime in.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for your patience during the brief interruption. I appreciate the time to evacuate the building that appeared to be flooding while we were doing board meeting. So I'm just going to pick it back up from where we were with some of the conversation around the program quality backbone. And want to go through a couple of the key levers quickly. And I think we will try to, after talking to Chair Lasso, try to move the second agenda item to a subsequent meeting, and we'll work on that. But to start right now with making sure we get through the program work. Christina, we've talked a little bit about this and the structure and thinking about some of the pivots for operationalizing. I wanted to make sure that we were also talking about what the key components of this theory of change are. And as you look at some of the QRIS backbone of where we see the integration of a lot of key functions at EEC being able to move forward. So yes, Christine, if you can move to the next slide. So looking at how licensing lays the foundation for quality. So I won't read you this in the interest of time and the delay we've already had, but I really wanted to focus on some of the work that we were doing and that we're doing right now in terms of ensuring that licensing is supported not only to be that monitoring requirement and the monitoring function, but also as the entry point to a continuous quality improvement plan, making sure that what's communicated from our monitoring and licensing entity teammates are aligned with the continuous quality improvement investments that we have through some of the other interventions and supports that are available. And so here, one of the things that we have been doing is creating a routine of collaboration amongst our own teams here at EEC to make sure that licensors are supported to understanding what access other programs are using to initiate quality engagement, and also really thinking about the use of the CQIP, the continuous quality improvement plans, as part of our licensing and monitoring protocols. So this is work that has been conceptualized, been working with our regional offices on it, and is in the process of moving out and operationalizing in a way that we can make sure that we are supporting the integration of our licensing into a quality improvement space. So moving on to the next slide, the second component of this is really thinking about the professional development centers that have been about 18 months into operations now, and thinking about the role that they play in terms of supporting not only, if you think about the licensing and the integration of licensing into quality, that PDCs have the ability to do more coaching and leadership supports that can align with licensing. So here we have the PDCs have been operating and working together to identify a component of the information on the quality improvement supports that are needing there, but the supports that are working with the programs, but ensuring that we also integrate that work with the licensing. And so it is really a continuous quality improvement support, and that we're functioning in that supportive way for our programs too. So this becomes a key component in that QRIS 2.0, is that if we are genuinely looking for a QRIS to be able to help us evaluate a mentality of continuous quality improvement, then ensuring those that are there and invested in to help advance that quality are helping evaluate and provide insight into the ways the continuous quality improvement are being actualized in program is a key integration into our monitoring and licensing system as well that we're working on through this. So moving on to the next slide of thinking about the ECSOs and how those are really thinking about the good to great strategies. So when we think about the backbone of quality and understanding that first tier of licensing as an entry point to quality, PDCs as a coaching and supporting a continuous quality improvement mentality, really understanding that ECSO, the early childhood support organizations, is helping those who have achieved the structures of quality to help hone in on the incorporating data and instruction, and focusing on the theory of change that if there are structural components of quality, that you have regular supervisions with staff, for example, and leadership is supported to leverage that time using a scaffolded curriculum, that we should be able to sustain more impact for child outcomes. And so really thinking about that, the continuous quality improvement mentality is supporting those who have been able to achieve a baseline of moving on to the second, to the good to great components, and really investing in, I think, in this work, not only thinking about what it takes to support programs, but what it takes to do it at scale. Because I think what we've seen in our early childhood support organizations is demonstrated effectiveness of supporting organizations in really honing in on instructional excellence in center-based programs, but thinking about that next level of how a supportive system captures what they are doing and scales it so that it isn't a sustained engagement with this organization, but rather the organization, that the work the organization is doing is respected, is codified in policy in a way that allows us to incorporate that into the QRIS score as well. So those are some of the work we're doing around this theory of change. If you can go on to the next slide, Christina. Sorry, one back, I think. So as you can see, all of these investments require us to think differently around how we support the system, the coordinated system that people are engaging in. And so while these are all, these initiatives all feed into a theory of change, the bigger question, I think, for us is how we are supporting our own operations to be able to incorporate not these as a series of one-off initiatives, but as a comprehensive impact for programs that we are supporting programs when they enter into our system, that we are working with them to foster the kind of continuous quality improvement mentality, and then we are finding not just one size fits all approaches, but once structures have been established, of being able to offer more refined, more specific support that is honing in on specific interventions around instruction that can accelerate impact for children and families. So you can see this all relies on us working differently. And so moving on to the next slide, there are a couple of things we wanted to make sure that this is really understood, is that, and I won't spend a lot of time on this because I want to get to a vote, and I know we have limited time today, but really understanding that our system that we are creating here does rely on a data-driven approach. And so in order for our system to function as effectively as possible across all of these, we need to be incorporating our own parallel process of looking at data on the impact our program supports are having on our program sustainability, of understanding where teachers and where teacher qualifications are driving that program improvement, and where and how that differs across regions. And so really what we want to look here is these routines of collaboration that we are engaging in internally to make sure that the systems are there to support this theory of change, is vital on us incorporating data into those conversations in meaningful ways. So moving on to the next slide. I'm going to breeze through some of this in a way that is not going to do it justice. So we will make sure that we bring back when we talk about the budgeting work. But I want to make sure that that what we are also looking at is, or what you're also understanding is that while we are focusing on a definition of quality, the supports to achieve quality, the backbone to define and make sure we are all using the same language for quality, that we also know that there's a financing strategy that will need to be considered in terms of making sure that that quality is aligned to the way we finance the system as a whole. And so as we move to the next, slide, I wanted to highlight that this is work that we've been doing with Third Sector Capital Partners. That is a national group that works with our overall that works with with human service and government entities to try to understand how we can evaluate outcomes in our funding models. We have been generously supported by the Commonwealth Children's Fund to work with them in a short-term engagement that will help us build a theoretical model for, as Joan was saying at the beginning of the meeting, to really look at this long-standing question that certainly you all have been grappling with long before I got here, as to how is a different way, or what is a different way of financing a system aside from this per child per day model, and what would it take? What are the obligations, and what are the impacts of that when we look at some key indicators like equity, like sustainability, and like access to vulnerable populations as well. So here you have the project overview. I won't read this to you in the interest of time, but want to highlight, if you move on, Christian, the next slide, want to highlight a couple of the key elements that we are at now. So again, this project overview is really looking at alternative financing structures that aren't per child per day, but could enhance some of the tuition reimbursement structures we currently have in our subsidy system. So we've been in the process of understanding priorities, bringing the work of the strategic plan into actualization. As we know, this has been a long-standing conversation. We've just started some of the stakeholder engagement to understand the variety of perspectives and priorities that need to be continued here, and we'll continue to make sure that we have the information to report back to you as we solidify a model. If we go to the next slide, I want to highlight that both what we're looking at in the model and the principles for what we're looking at here, and how we have been driving the conversation. Obviously, there are a number of different ways to measure each of these elements. So this conversation around how we are addressing them will be further refined as we engage with the stakeholders and understand the variety of different competing ways we think about this. But essentially what we're looking for is a theoretical model that will allow us to engage in conversations over the course of budget decisions and beyond, to understand what kind of criteria and what kind of levers should be pulled to help address stability of programs, an adequate level of services for programs to invest in staff and the types of family supports that are needed, as well as looking at the impact on equity, both if you move, as you look at things like gateway cities and investment and sustaining programs in childcare deserts, different definitions of equity that we are grappling with to ensure that we are measuring with all lenses. And then again, not doing something that is so overly complex that it is not sustainable, but looking for simplicity in a way that allows it to be sustainable. Moving on to the next slide. I'm happy to take questions on that. In the interest of time, want to make sure we get to some of the EEOST questions that also play into that, but really wanted to make sure you all had a highlight of this really critical work and strategic thinking that will be in play over the next couple months, as we know, budget decisions are also asking for the same kind of analysis of different components of budget conversation. So maybe before I move on to EEOST, I will make sure, are there any key questions? And then I'm happy to move right along. Okay. All right, I'm going to go on to
Joan Wasser-Gish.
Oh, sorry.
Question, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah,
sorry, I'll be quick. Back on the program quality support piece, I just had 2 questions, and if we don't have time for them now, maybe we can pick them up at another time. One of the things that wasn't entirely clear to me is exactly who will serve as the point of contact for programs and work with them in partnership to do things like self-assess and develop a continuous quality improvement plan. And will we then use the data from the plan to also inform the constellation of supports that's both a fit for that program, but also what we need to generate throughout the system more broadly?
Yep, absolutely. No, this is a great question, and thank you for clarifying it. One, I think that we anticipate leveraging the point of contact that exists between the licensor and the program more effectively towards that quality improvement. So that will continue to be a key interaction between EEC and the program. But I think and right now we have program quality specialists, but they work with a subset of programs and a smaller capacity. And as we look to expand the impact and the reach of the QRIS, one of the questions will be, and has been for us internally, is how do we integrate those more so that it is not 2 separate contacts with the program, but one supportive contact with the program that is aligned. And I think to that point, really looking at the CQIP as exactly as you pointed out, which is a living, breathing a document that both allows us to engage with the provider, but also aggregate exactly those data points that can help understand what kinds of investments would be most strategic and most impactful for the field. And I think right now, from an operational lens, and why we're talking about the program theory of change in more depth right now, is because we're at exactly those conversations internally to understand what would need to be captured in a CQIP, how would that align with a corrective action plan, for example, or a monitoring plan, or any other of the ways that programs capture different data for EEC. So we're really doing that operational work now, given the great foundation and groundwork that was laid for a lot of the components of the theory of change, of wrapping them up into an operational plan, just as you suggested. Yeah. Yeah. Sweet. So any other, sorry, I'm having trouble getting everyone's stuff on my
Hi, Sam.
Yeah.
Hi. Sorry, just a quick question for you. So a lot of the things on the quality improvement kind of plan would cost money. And, I'm thinking about, everybody having people to screen for, do the ASQs, having home visits, things like that. They all cost money. And so I'm just wondering how how EEC is sort of weighing those sort of costs of quality against sort of a priority on, having equity and access, and what's guiding the decision making there, I guess. If you could just provide a little bit of context there, that would be great.
Yeah, so I think that ultimately what we know right now is that, and all of our research showed throughout the strategic planning and in the strategic plan, that our rates are not adequately covering the cost of quality. And so one of the things, Nikki, to your point, is that is the first step of some of our kicking the tires on what a financing model will look like, or what are actual expectations of inputs that cost money. So, and right now we have a market rate, but we're really trying to dig deeper into some of the cost of quality metrics that we evaluated during the strategic planning, but need far more rigorous testing to be, utilized to drive rate setting in any way. And then so that's the first part of the question, is that a recognition that they do cost quality, but needing to dig a little bit deeper into what the cost is and how that aggregates into a cost per classroom or per program or per family child care home that ultimately is allows us to look at the cost to operations as opposed to the cost per child, because ultimately you're operating a program, and that is the shift away from a per child mode, which is essentially taking the cost of the program and dividing by a max enrollment, as opposed to a cost of the program and identifying how we sustain a quality operation. So it's a very different shift, I think, in how we talk about it. From the equity lens, I think this is a really hard question, because and this is a conversation I started to have nationally too, there is an understanding that by prioritizing children through the subsidy system, that is adding to equity. But I think what we've seen over the last couple of decades nationally is that playing out in various ways of creating inequitable systems, and really having to do some analysis of what data we're using to judge our equity impact. And that's one of the things we're doing in the financing system. And the reason why I say that the subsidy not necessarily adding to equity is that while it certainly does provide some dent in accessibility, we haven't necessarily tiered the policies in a way that would drive an equitable distribution necessarily, or use that as an evaluation point of our efficacy. So one of the things we're looking at with third sector, as we start to think about moving away from a per child, or what that would look like to think differently, is to understand how what kind of metrics we're using to drive an equitable lens. So when we think about like a Chapter 70, there's all sorts of metrics built in there that help account for community demographics, for example. And so those are questions, which ones of those that work in a market such as this? Do you look at just distribution? And so, okay, is there equity just in terms of every program gets something? Do you tier it based on who they're serving? How do you not disincentivize serving the children who are the most costly to serve, who need more wraparound services? So those are the sort of questions we're like deep in the middle of trying to figure out how do we evaluate those metrics now. And I think we'll look in the next 4 to 6 weeks to bring back different ways and different lenses to help us evaluate something that we feel is appropriate for the system we're trying to build.
Great, thanks so much. I'm looking forward to more. It's great work.
Me too. All right, anyone else you see? Sorry, it's hard. I can't see everyone on one place like I can on my other computer at work. Okay, not seeing anyone else. I'm going to move on to the EEOST stuff. Okay, and then happy to take questions. Feel free to interrupt. So quickly, one of the things we recognize, and this is one of the immediate actions when we start to look at the needs of the system right now in programs, is the fact that our early education out of school time capital grant, which you may all have the background of here, is really targeted to programs that are to grants that were about $1 million. And knowing that right now the needs of the field were much more prevalent around smaller investments to care for health and safety, and much less trying to build whole new buildings as we look at the reality of the field. If you want to move on to the next slide, Christina. One of the things that we are looking to do is to revise those grants for this year, that in a way that would allow us to move from a grant award of about $400,000 to $1 million, to move to about $100,000 to $250,000 grants that would allow us to spread the dollars farther and really specifically work to address the real FY21 needs of our community, where people are buying new windows or ventilation systems, upgrading roofs, things that are needed for buildings just to sustain right now, and particularly needed when we evaluate the COVID needs of our programs. So in Sustain the Programs, we have opted to try to move the grants to this to be responsive to the field, but in being able to do that quickly, we've been revising the application, making sure that the application and the process are appropriate, and have run into two minor issues with our regs that require us to address some barriers that could be encountered if we weren't careful. And so we are asking for a vote on the regs that would do it's two things that the grant size is not outlined, but really in particular shortening the length of the grant obligation. A 25-year grant obligation is maybe appropriate for $1 million grant and a less appropriate for a $250,000 grant. And so making sure that we can simplify the application and shorten the duration, the obligation of the recipient to the state if they are a grant recipient. Are the two emergency regulations that we are asking for the board to vote on today. I want to highlight also the reason why emergency regulations is obviously these will trigger public comment and we will come back to finalize. But given the urgency of getting this grant application out the door and making sure programs can start applying, we felt it important to be working under actual regulations right now, even if they are in an emergency status. So giving us time to do the official process, but making sure that we were all legally sewn up in terms of being able to move this quickly. So I believe that that's the last slide. And go to the next one, Christina, because I'm missing something. Oh, yes. So these are the specifics of the proposed emergency regulatory changes, which you also have in your materials. And I believe that at this point, I'm happy to take any questions and move to finalizing.
Just jump in if you have questions, because it's hard to do the gallery view is not as good when we're screen sharing, or folks can use the raise hand.
Commissioner, it's Mary Wallachie. I just wanted to really applaud you and your team, and I'm sure the Children's Investment Fund as well, for deciding to move to this flexible approach to this grant program. Excuse me. When we were building Educator in Springfield, sorry, we were fortunate enough to get an EEOST grant, and it was wonderful and it was useful because it was a very big project for 14 million. But I think the reality of that probably not being the case now for many providers is really well, very well timed. The other thing I'll say is I'm really pleased to see that you've written that you're going to streamline the application process. Again, we're so appreciative of the resources for Educator, but I will tell you that the application was exhaustive and we killed a lot of trees. And so maybe that was appropriate for $1 million grant, but it clearly does beg really streamlining if we're going to try to give out resources, A, quickly, and then B, do it efficiently for both the department, the Children's Investment Fund, and for the applicant. So really just thank you for doing it, and certainly I'm a strong I'll give you a strong vote to make those changes.
Thank you.
Tony.
Hi. What Mary said, yes, everything. I think expediting this is really important for the field. Folks have scrambled and continue to scramble. So I applaud the efforts of the department to make this as efficient as possible for folks to get it. Down the road, if we can ever catch our collective breath, I would love to come back to a question I asked maybe 6 or 8 months ago about finding out if these investments did improve quality. I think right now we're looking at a different reason. We really want to get these programs up to health and safety standards, and I get that. But I think this started the fund started to really address quality. And so maybe down the road, we can look at that and see how it is. Mm-hmm. Just one more question. What is the total amount of this grant, please?
So it's the 4.7, I believe we have $3.7 million allocated this year.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. It's in one of the slides. I can't remember which.
I know. Thanks.
I know. I was like, I believe it's 3.7 allocated this year for grants.
Thank you.
Sam, can you please just clarify whether these changes are just for FY21 or would carry forward?
At this point, they're just for FWA. They are written in a way that would allow the flexibility during the state of emergency, and then we can reevaluate the overall regulatory changes based on, you know, the bigger analysis at Joni's question or others that come up around if there's other modifications that would need to be made in an ongoing way after that.
All right. Shall we go forth? I'll make a motion. It's a long one. Get ready. Okay. I move that the board, in accordance with Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 15D, Section 3, hereby approves the amended regulations governing the Early Education and Out-of-School Time Capital Fund Grant Program and authorizes the Commissioner of Early Education and Care to file the amended regulations with the Secretary of the Commonwealth for publication in the Massachusetts Register for promulgation on an emergency basis as 606 MR 15, consistent with the department's proposed policy directions and subject to the approval of the final regulations after a public comment period by the board. Can I have a second? All right, I'm going to go around right now. In my view, Joan Wasser-Gish.
Yes.
Eleonora Villegas-Reimers.
Yes.
David Cruz.
Yes.
Joni Block.
Yes.
Sheila Balboni. I think you're muted.
Yeah, yes, for Balboni.
Thank you, Mary Wallachie.
Yes.
Carolyn Kane.
Yes.
Jim Pizer.
Yes.
Allison Schoenwald.
Yes.
Great. Approved. Commissioner, let me just echo what Mary said, which is I really appreciate your taking the time to be thoughtful. This is the kind of thing that I think can easily just get passed along and kicked down the road in the middle of a quasi-crisis. I don't know if we can keep calling it a crisis anymore, but we can if we want. But nevertheless, I just appreciate that you're still working on some of these strategic issues, quality improvement, thinking hard about the field, and especially in this case, implementation, streamline that application, all great moves in service of mission. So, and the field. So thank you.
Thank you.
I just want to echo that.
Oh, sorry.
This
Go
is
ahead.
Carolyn. I just wanted to echo that and thank the commissioner and her team for all of their incredibly hard work. I am still incredibly impressed day in and day out about the amount of effort that they've put forth during this incredibly challenging time. And, you know, kudos to all of them.
Yeah, very positive energy too, which is just amazing.
That's an amazing department.
I think this could be unprecedented. We started with the commissioner on Sleeper Street. She's now in her house. The meeting will be adjourned. We will be in touch about our second planned item on the fiscal side. Actually really looking forward to that strategy. And as I wrote to all of you, I really appreciate the idea that we'd sort of get into a monthly discussion rather than these sort of one-off higher stakes approaches to budgeting and spending. So that will happen. We'll aim for, say, by the end of October, we'll get scheduling tomorrow on that and be in touch. But again, thank you. Great big thanks from all of us to all of you in the field doing the very hard work and the really important work of supporting the Commonwealth's children and their families. And we'll look forward to being in touch soon. So thanks again. We're adjourned.
Thank you. Good to see everyone.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Folks, thank you.